Eh bien, voilà, avec des caractéristiques tout à fait tocquevilliennes, nos conversations ont été inaugurées. Je dois dire qu'il y a beaucoup de pain sur la planche. Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à notre prix Nobel, ça a été formidable, mais merci aussi à notre représentant du Cotentin qui a donné des idées extrêmement intéressantes pour ces conversations. Tocqueville, qui ont une personnalité. Moi, je dirais, je suis plus ambitieuse. Quelqu'un a dit, on va être le Davos. Non, Davos va devenir, quand ils grandissent, ils comprennent qu'il faut converser. Voilà, converser a un problème, c'est qu'on prend du temps. Et voilà, nous sommes coincés, notre table ronde, entre l'inauguration et le déjeuner. Et alors, on va déborder, parce que voilà, ça, c'est aussi l'esprit de Tocqueville. On déborde un petit peu, mais pas beaucoup. On va déborder jusqu'à 1h30, ce qui fait qu'on doit vraiment faire bon usage du temps. Voilà le thème de notre conversation. Et donc, la fin de l'idée de paix perpétuelle. Mais avant de rentrer dans le vif du sujet, je voudrais quand même remercier et être bref dans les remerciements. Franchement, je crois que Jean-Guillaume, Stéphanie, merci pour votre générosité et pour votre inspiration toujours. Laure, c'est notre machine intellectuelle. Voilà. Et puis, il y a la grande famille Tocqueville, les amis, les collaborateurs. Et sans ça, nous aurions une autre personnalité. Il ne faut pas perdre la personnalité de Tocqueville. Donc, voilà, je ne vais pas faire d'introduction de mes panélistes, mais je dois faire une introduction en tant que modérateur. Et c'est l'usage du temps. Je veux garder 20 minutes pour les questions. Donc, préparez vos questions. Je veux aussi dire que nous avons l'avantage d'avoir les jeunes avec nous. Et parmi les jeunes, je veux personnaliser aussi Léonore et Alexis de Tocqueville, qui sont la nouvelle génération. Donc, dans 20 ans, on reviendra ici et ce sera eux à mener avec tous ceux qui sont ici, tous les jeunes, la jeune génération qui ferait les conversations de Tocqueville. Et nous, on vous écoutera. Alors, voilà, je vais faire... Avant de rentrer sur le vif du sujet de la paix perpétuelle, et ce qui d'ailleurs, il faut dire que notre Alexandra Matejki nous a donné le cue, as you say in English. The cue, I have reread, because I was going to moderate, I have reread the Perpetual piece. I have reread it. And there is a sentence that when she was saying that Ukraine must win and Russia must lose. And this is the bottom line. And that there is no peace when there is occupation. Occupation and peace, it's an oxymoron. Occupation and peace. And in Perpetual Peace, Kant writes, a state is not the ground which it occupies, a piece of property. It is a society of men and women whom no one else has any right to command or dispose except the state itself. It is a trunk with its own roots. But to incorporate it to another state, like a graft, is to destroy its existence as a moral person, reducing it to a thing. Et c'est là où vent debout, les Ukrainiens disent non, et heureusement l'Occident s'est réveillé, et l'Europe avec l'Occident. Deux commentaires de ma part. Je crois we have said that the issue nowadays in Europe is that we thought that it was perpetual peace. Well, not all Europe. The Eastern Europe and the New Europe, and I won't go to old Europe and New Europe, but there is an old Europe and New Europe, and today we see this how the initiative is going to the east. Laure has said it. It's Poland, it's the Baltics, it's Czechia, it's in the east. And this is because they never thought never has been in their minds that history had finished. On the contrary, I think, and maybe France is a bit of an exception, it's not just that we thought that the end of history, is that we had a voluntary amnesia on our past, especially on our recent past. And this was how Europe was built, how the European Union, how the European community. We have heard that there was a kind of a mercantilist approach, and it is true. And this mercantilist approach was made, well, let's do soft power, let's just, peace will be reached through exchange. This was this idea. This is Westpolitik, and this is, in the end, one of the drivers of the European Union. So with this very short introduction, I will turn first to Nicolas Baverez. I will say that Nicolas Baverez, I read him his first book on Aron. And it was, I think the title was Aron, a moralist in an ideological time. And how do you see this sequence about peace and war? And not perpetual peace, but I hope that we will not go into a state where we accept that there is a perpetual state of non-peace or war. Oh, by the way, sorry, logistics. Please, the intervention from the floor, not more than 3 minutes. Please, your responses, just keep it relatively short. We haven't addressed the topic of the day, which is what's going on. You can just put in some comments on this, but I think that we have to go to the real topic beyond what's going on today in Moscow or who knows where. So, Nicolas.
Merci beaucoup, Anna. Je vais m'autoriser du fait qu'on est à Tocqueville, effectivement, pour parler en français et essayer comme ça d'être bref. On a beaucoup, évidemment, parlé d'Ukraine, mais je crois que ce qui se passe aujourd'hui est encore plus important. C'est-à-dire que tous ceux qui ont expliqué que la guerre d'Ukraine était une guerre européenne ou une guerre occidentale se trompent, et que c'est bien une guerre mondiale, une guerre qui transforme le monde. Quand on regarde l'histoire, elle n'est pas linéaire, elle stagne et puis elle accélère brutalement. Elle accélère autour de ce que Solzhenitsyn appelait des nœuds, c'est-à-dire des moments où les crises s'entrecroisent et où elle crée des basculements du monde. Et c'est ce qui s'est passé en 2022. Vous avez rappelé Raymond Aron. Raymond Aron, en 1960, à Londres, avait prononcé une conférence sur ce qu'il appelait l'aube de l'histoire universelle. Il avait anticipé la fin de la guerre froide et il avait conclu en disant jamais les hommes n'ont eu autant de raisons de coopérer, jamais ils n'ont eu autant de raisons de ne plus s'entretuer. L'histoire universelle va émerger, mais je ne crois pas qu'elle sera pacifique. Et c'est exactement ce à quoi nous sommes confrontés. Tous les hommes aujourd'hui vivent la même histoire à travers ce monde interconnecté, mais c'est un monde qui est tout sauf pacifique. C'est un monde dont on va voir à quel point il est gouverné par la violence. Donc je voudrais très vite vous proposer pour le débat 3 idées, vous montrer qu'on est bien dans une grande confrontation entre les démocraties et les régimes autoritaires, vous montrer comment les démocraties ont perdu la paix de 1989 et voir comment est-ce qu'on peut effectivement essayer de défendre la liberté dans ce 21e siècle qui va être très différent de ce qu'on avait imaginé. Dans le grand schisme, en 1947, Aron avait défini la guerre froide avec sa fameuse formule « paix impossible, guerre improbable ». C'était en 1947, avant même que l'Union soviétique accède à l'arme nucléaire. Ça a été encore plus vrai après. Et on peut dire qu'aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en 1989 ? On a cru que c'était le monde de la guerre impossible et de la paix permanente. Et le basculement de 2022, c'est que nous réalisons que nous sommes dans un monde où la paix redevient impossible et où la guerre est omniprésente. Elle est omniprésente, évidemment, la guerre de haute intensité en Ukraine, mais aussi la guerre hybride que mène la Russie contre l'Europe et la violence qui est en train de sortir de toutes les limites qu'on avait essayé de lui assigner. C'est pour ça que ce que nous venons d'entendre sur le combat des droits de l'homme est extrêmement important. Parce que quand on se tourne sur tous les continents, aujourd'hui, la violence explose et surtout, elle est hors limite et hors contrôle. Donc, ceci se traduit par l'explosion de la mondialisation qui se reconstitue en blocs. Nous avons donc un bloc occidental, un bloc des empires avec cette alliance très forte entre la Russie et la Chine qui est bizarre parce que les dirigeants et les peuples se détestent, mais la haine de l'Occident et de la liberté est supérieure à leur détestation. Et il ne faut pas oublier le Sud, qui joue un rôle aujourd'hui très important, qui s'est émancipé et qui, derrière le multi-alignement, en réalité est un Sud où la détestation du passé colonial et de l'Occident prend aujourd'hui le pas sur les relations qui peuvent être parfois compliquées avec la Chine. Donc, le principe de ce monde, et c'est là où est la bascule de 2022, c'est que c'est un monde où la géopolitique a pris sa revanche sur l'économie, où les États dominent aujourd'hui les marchés, où la protection a pris le pas sur le libre-échange et où la sécurité gouverne maintenant la recherche de l'optimisation des coûts. Comment est-ce qu'on en est arrivé là ? Eh bien, avec des démocraties qui ont été des somnambules. Il y a 3 guerres mondiales dans le XXe siècle et 3 paix. Première guerre mondiale, paix ratée de 1918. Deuxième guerre mondiale, paix réussie de 1945, alors même qu'on a l'ombre portée de l'Union soviétique. Elle est réussie pourquoi ? Parce qu'on parvient, d'abord les vaincus acceptent leur défaite, Japon, Allemagne, et de se remettre en question. Ensuite, il y a un ordre mondial. Et enfin, il y a les États-Unis qui sont capables de le réassurer sur le plan économique et sur le plan militaire. Donc ça fonctionne. Et la troisième paix, 1989, on est dans le modèle 1918, c'est une paix ratée. C'est une paix ratée parce qu'il n'y a pas de reconnaissance de la défaite par les vaincus, et donc la Russie, parce qu'il n'y a pas de reconstruction d'un ordre mondial, et parce on va voir que les garanties s'effondrent. Et donc les démocraties, alors qu'on les a crues triomphantes, entre l'hubris, la démesure des États-Unis et l'inconséquence des Européens, les démocraties qu'on croyait triomphantes vont réussir à perdre le contrôle de l'ordre mondial en 2001, avec les guerres enlisées perdues d'Afghanistan, d'Irak, de Syrie, pour la France, le Sahel et l'erreur de la Libye. Et on perd le contrôle du capitalisme mondialisé en 2008. On perd le contrôle de la santé publique en 2020. Donc, il y a eu cette perte et derrière, la crise intérieure, le populisme, la déstabilisation des classes moyennes. Donc, on se retrouve dans l'étau des années 30 avec, d'un côté, une menace extérieure qu'on a laissé se reconstituer sans la voir, les empires autoritaires. On ne s'occupe que du djihadisme, qui est par ailleurs une menace bien réelle. Et à l'intérieur, la montée des démagogues et des partis extrémistes. Et là-dedans, l'Europe se retrouve en première ligne sans l'avoir voulu. Elle se retrouve avec un modèle caduc. Et on voyait cette grande confrontation arriver en Asie avec Taïwan, et elle a démarré sur notre continent avec un conflit de haute intensité pour la première fois depuis 1945. Alors, le troisième temps, c'est comment est-ce que ça se présente pour la liberté politique au XXIe siècle ? Eh bien, en fait, ces démocraties doivent réfléchir à une nouvelle stratégie. Je vous renvoie à Kennan en 1946 et à son long télégramme, qui est quand même une extraordinaire prescience. Donc en 1946, Kennan définit la politique qui va gagner en 1989. Il dit pas de déni sur l'Union soviétique, il n'y a pas de compromis possible, contrairement à ce que pensait Roosevelt. Mais deuxièmement, il faut le cantonnement militaire et stratégique, il ne faut pas l'escalade, et il faut continuer à dialoguer avec les leaders et les sociétés, parce qu'un jour ou l'autre, ça cédera de l'intérieur. Et je crois qu'aujourd'hui, il faut s'en inspirer. Pas de déni sur la réalité de cette alliance des empires autoritaires. Il faut reconnaître leur dangerosité. Il faut retrouver la supériorité militaire et technologique. Il ne faut pas tomber dans l'erreur de l'escalade. Il faut dialoguer avec les sociétés et il ne faut pas perdre le Sud. Pour l'Europe, ça veut dire aussi qu'il faut une nouvelle alliance entre le pôle nord-américain, le pôle européen, le pôle asiatique. Il faut une Europe puissance. Et donc, pour ça, il faut la conversion très compliquée par le fait que cette Europe a été créée autour du marché et du droit pour contourner le politique et le stratégique après l'échec de la communauté européenne de défense. Il faut refonder le système autour de la sécurité et de la souveraineté dans un moment où elle va s'élargir à 38 pays. Et la dernière chose que je voudrais vous dire, c'est que cette année 2022 est une année tragique, sanglante, terrible. C'est aussi une année d'espoir. C'est l'année, et nous l'avons vu encore la semaine dernière, où les empires autoritaires qui se disaient invincibles, supérieurs à nous sur la croissance, la stabilité politique et la projection de puissance militaire, ont conjugué des problèmes énormes sanitaires en Chine, des problèmes démographiques, des problèmes économiques et un désastre stratégique pour la Russie qui se confirme aujourd'hui. C'est aussi l'année où les démocraties ont montré qu'elles étaient capables de réagir et qu'elles n'étaient pas forcément décadentes. Mais c'est vrai que ceci reste à confirmer. Ce qui s'est passé la semaine dernière, ça nous montre que la Russie est fragile, mais aussi qu'elle reste extrêmement dangereuse. Et je vous laisserai donc avec, pour le clin d'œil pour Anna, avec Aron de nouveau. En juin 1939, il disait la chose suivante: « Je crois à la victoire finale des démocraties, mais à une condition, c'est qu'elles le veuillent. » Eh bien, c'est aujourd'hui exactement la situation. Je crois que nous pouvons espérer dans la victoire finale des démocraties, mais à la condition que leurs citoyens le veuillent encore. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Nicolas Baverez. Il faut revenir à Aron. C'est un des grands penseurs occidentaux et notamment européens. Moi, je dois dire que j'ai plongé dans Aron. Et je dois dire que Nicolas Baverez m'a beaucoup aidé avec son premier livre. Oui, c'était en 93, 92, quelque chose comme ça. Now we go. So now we go back, and I'm going to ask you. You are Slawomir Debski. You are director of Paix. Paix is the fantastic think tank that in Warsaw, and I have been the honor of being invited there. So allow me to just challenge you. You have Alexis de Tocqueville knocking on the door of Paix, and you are there and you launch a conversation. And I say a door because if Alexis de Tocqueville comes here, it's different. It's home. That's completely different. But he goes to Warsaw. He knocks on your door and you are there and you moderate him. What do you think he would say and what would you say?
Well, thank you very much for having me. First, an explanation, I'm not Zbigniew Rau. So those who are surprised that Poland's foreign minister is not here require some explanation. He really wanted to be there. He was one of the establishers of the Alexis Tocqueville Research Center in Łódź 25 years ago, and Alexis Tocqueville is very close to his heart. He really wanted to appear here. Unfortunately, for technical reasons, he was unable. So I was asked by the organizer to jump in and to...
we are very happy to have you.
And to share some Polish approach to this question. Well, what I would say if I had a chance to meet Alexis Tocqueville, I would say that we should not give up. The idea of perpetual peace, the idea that democracy may actually provide effective barrier to the violence, to war, should be still with us. Those that are violators of the traffic rules doesn't mean that we don't need them. We still need traffic rules. So if Russia violates the world we would like to live in, it doesn't mean that we should give up the idea of peace. Well, we have been trying to delegitimize or delegalize use of force in international relations for ages. First, we try to do it philosophically. In the area in the Middle Ages, the huge debate about just and unjust war happened, with very clear concept that at least part of use of force can be delegitimized. Then we tried to improve our world by introducing democratic methods. That was 100 years ago Woodrow Wilson's idea to democratize international relations, to delegitimize secret convents of big powers, and create a kind of the parliament, because he really believed that parliament, democracy may prevent wars. Of course, he failed. I'm not going to go too deeply into this. But then, in 1928, French foreign minister and U.S. foreign minister Aristide Briand and James Kellogg signed a treaty delegitimizing, delegalizing war. We wanted to make war illegal. We believe in international law. We try to shape the world in which war is impossible, and we failed, of course. Then after 1945, there was a Nuremberg tribunal. We introduced the concept that the war criminals should not go unpunished. So we have to put a tag price to their actions, to their activities. I would say that President Vladimir Putin really knows what is legal and what is illegal in our contemporary world. That is why he was so careful to avoid the term war against Ukraine. He was so careful to avoid the term aggression on Ukraine. It is a special operation. He's very careful in choosing words for the reason he really wants to show this his aggression on Ukraine as something which, at least in his conceptualization of war, the first is legal and justified. And one more sentence into that. The lessons we should draw is from these attempts to delegitimize use of force in international affairs is that neither institutionalization, nor legal, nor philosophical, no political, because we try to change Russia by trade with them, and this attempt also failed. So 4 approaches to seizing war as a social phenomenon for our international relations failed. So what we can do? First, we should keep trying. Then we should arm ourselves, because we have to be ready for the situation when all our attempts simply failed. Our basic service, our basic responsibility to our citizens is to provide them peace and security. That's how and for the states do exist, and that's how and for the alliances exist. So we have to be ready for the situation when our attempts to delegitimize, delegalize wars failed. We have to be ready to face the reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Slawomir Debski, you have said that the state has to provide peace and security. This, just going back to the topic that we have, the idea on this is the Atlantic Charter is peace comes with prosperity, and prosperity comes through exchange. And the aspect of security is not in the Atlantic Charter. It's just a backdrop. And this idea of peace through prosperity and prosperity through exchange is a question for you, Reinhard Bütikofer. Allow me to say that Reinhard is if you have to go to the trenches, just make sure that he is with you. And he has been in the trenches of the European Union for the European Union construction, but also in the Atlanticist trenches, where we have met more than once, and the Atlanticist trenches are not always easy in the European Union. We all know that he's at the forefront on China, and I hope that we will have time to address this, if not in this roundtable, in another one. He's one of the powerful voices of the European Parliament, but you are German. In the end, you are German. So what I would like to ask you is, beyond all this, how do you see all that has been said? There have been several mentions to Germany. And again, honestly, Zeitenwende, does it come? Doesn't? Where? How? When? President Hollande said that we Europeans, we should get our act together. Maybe our shield against missiles, we shouldn't go to ask for technology of Israeli or US, or our combat planes, we could try some Europeans. And this is for you, Reinhard.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for this grandiose introduction. Part of what I'm doing in fighting is indeed making up for being German. Yeah? Okay. But let me start by echoing in a variation what Mr. Debski just said. I would also want to challenge.
Because we are in YouTube,
Okay.
Reinhard.
I would also. I guess it's on. Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. I would also want to start by echoing, in a way, what Mr. Debski said in challenging the topic of our conversation. I don't think we see the end of the myth of perpetual peace. Peace, like democracy, solidarity, republican principles, freedom, those are perennial values. But what we see and what we should make sure that everybody understands is a misconception of perpetual peace. President George W. Bush once called Germans a peace-loving nation, and I don't think he meant it as a compliment. And indeed, I have to confess that few countries, if any, have been more enamored with the idea of perpetual peace over the last couple of decades than my country. However, what most of us understood under that term was, I think, a self-serving caricature of what Kant had in mind when he wrote that book in 1795. And you certainly shouldn't blame Kant for that. It was a variation of the impossible dream of eating the cake without having acquired the ingredients to bake it first. The assumption that Germany, encircled by friends, as we used to say, would allow others to shoulder the burden of security while we stuck to being successful in trading. It's a variation of what the Austrians used to say in the Middle Ages. Let others take care of war you be happy by, well, they said marrying, we say doing trade. There was an irresponsibly substandard contribution to the European and transatlantic security from Germany, and there was absolutely no political will nowhere to change that for the better. And all of that culminated in the shameful construction under the name Nord Stream. Today, Germany is still a peace-loving nation, but I think many of our citizens have understood that a dream cannot stand in for the real thing, and that you cannot get peace on the cheap. The so-called Zeitenwende, which is a term that the Chancellor coined to announce that everybody had to be surprised when the full-scale Russian invasion got underway on February 24. To some degree, I would say is still an excuse, because it could have been possible to realize that the times were changing 8 years earlier if there would have been enough will to listen to our Central European neighbors. But still, Kant would call that Revolution der Denkart, or you can say a Copernican revolution in security thinking in Germany. And I think that is something that has changed for the good. When Robert Habeck, our present Minister of Economic Affairs, traveled to the eastern part of Ukraine and advocated in 2021 that Ukraine should be supplied with what he called defensive armaments, he was completely lonely in the German political class. And even after the beginning of the war, there was some hesitancy to really come to the fore. I just remind everybody of the long-standing battle over the battle tanks, whether they should be provided. But today, Germany is one of the major suppliers of armaments to Ukraine. And I think one lesson that people have learned is this: war cannot be moderated away, regardless of the cost, but has to be decided. This war has to be decided, and it has to end with a win for Ukraine. And that is supported by roughly 2/3 of the German public. Even if you ask the question, are you willing to sacrifice somewhat in order to allow Ukraine to win, 2/3 say yes. So there is some change, not just in thinking, but also beginning in practice. NATO has never been more popular or well accepted, and everybody would probably subscribe to the notion that NATO is there to have the US in, the Russians out, and the Europeans united. Germany is rebuilding its army. Germany just announced that we will station 4,000 troops permanently in Lithuania. There is a willingness, a new willingness to engage with security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. The Chancellor has mentioned the idea of an air defense shield for Europe together. So I think you could say there's a gradual normalization of Germany in that regard. What I also consider very relevant is that the German Sonderweg with regard to Russia is definitely over. That has persisted for more than 100 years. But now that is ancient history. And at the same time, the concept of strategic autonomy that had been so divisive throughout Europe has lost luster. Yes, the EU must increase its ability to act autonomously, but the more basic principle is the principle of strategic solidarity with like-minded partners. Let me end by saying where I see the limits of the change. There are still quite a few. Of course, implementation is still to be seen. I think there is a limit in a lack of understanding that we need to integrate and concentrate European defense industry. I think if we would have a debate in Germany over boots on the ground, that would be a completely new story. And also, in a wider context, we haven't fully learned the Zeitenwende. We're not applying that lesson to our China relations yet. It's easy, I would say, I would assume, to understand that you cannot allow your country to become economically dependent on an authoritarian regime, but if that applies to Putin, it certainly applies to Xi Jinping also. But that's not unanimous in Germany. And also, we're not yet fully aware, and I'm grateful to my colleague here on the panel for looking at the developing world. We're not fully aware of our responsibility for some of the reasons of insecurity in the rest of the world. So I believe, yes, indeed, we are not where we should be, but whereas Kant acknowledged that war is, as he said, the status naturalis, not giving up on the myth is very important also politically. We cannot allow those who would side with Putin to own the peace narrative. And I think we should also understand that the United Nations Charter is partially built on the basis of what Kant pointed out in the 18th century. The Prussian Field Marshal von Moltke once called the idea of perpetual peace an ugly idea because war is an element of God's order. I don't think that's modern thinking.
Well, thank you, Reinhard. By the way, if you are in Twitter, follow him. Because as you have seen, he gives you just tweets. I have picked up two that are my introduction to Admiral Franken. The first is that let us Europeans, let's stop about strategic autonomy, speaking, just and act more on strategic solidarity. But the one that really is my cue to you is what he has said, paraphrasing Lord Ismay, the first NATO Secretary General. Yes, today it makes sense. NATO is extremely well. I would say that it has a bright future to keep the Russians out, the Europeans together and, coordinated, but frankly, the US in. In the end, all this myth of the perpetual peace, we could afford it because we had the security of the United States umbrella protecting us. So my question to you is, how bad is the situation in the United States? We have heard in the introduction just Lord Mandeville saying whatever happens in the United States, and others saying, well, in the United States things are not that clear. Can we count on them? But allow me, because you are a military, could you, just this is a footnote, but how do you see the morale in the battlefields of the Russian troops today? Just a short thing, because you bring a perspective that neither of our introductory just speakers had. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And this is a classified discussion, I guess? No? Okay, well, I can talk military and asymmetric operations, et cetera, but I'm not. I'm going to tell what happened in America and how we became that questionable partner to Europe in the last 7, 8 years. So it goes something like this. First of all, America is happy with capitalism. We really are. As long as the government serves as a referee. We're happy with wealth accumulation as long as it's fair. We're happy to pay taxes as long as we see those expenditures to be wise. We're happy with our political process. This is true because in the end, after we've exhausted all possibilities, we tend to do the right thing. Sometimes it takes us a bit. This is for the young people. This is how America got here, and this is a lesson in democracy. First of all, in the 1980s, so what is that, 8 score ago, there was an economic rebalancing, a tax structure which favored the high-income earnings. Opportunities related to social class rose. There was a debt by design to roll back progressivism. The Great Society was no longer considered a good thing. There was some deregulation that occurred to make it all more easy. And then we had the savings and loan debacle, where in rural Iowa, there was no bailout. It hurt every family equally bad. In the 1990s, I call it the lethargy of democracy, the rise of social distinctions, a shift from the Democrats in the South to more of a diffuse perspective, a rise of capitalism above all else, quick riches in the tech industry, and totally, and you may find this interesting, a disregard for what happened with USSR and the fragmenting of the Russian states today. They just didn't care. We were inward looking. We didn't pay attention. The 2000s, I call that the decade of despair. This is what happens when you start an unneeded war. The housing collapse left more people in debt. The state governments, local governments gerrymandered so that a minority dictated the majority. Debt became a tool of capitalism, and we doubled down on the trickle-down economics of the 80s. And the debt, again, became a tool for capitalism to walk back from social progressivism. 2010, I call it the naivety of innocence at the local level. The exporting of jobs became generally finished. Small-town Iowa, Minnesota, etc., became hollowed out from industry. Open discussions called for violence in media. An unsettled tension came throughout the land, and it separated families, marriages, businesses. Everything became political. Mowing your lawn on Sunday was a political act. It was crazy. And then the election of 2020. It was salvation, I think, for the US participation in Ukraine. But it doesn't come without a cost. There's still problems and social tensions in America. But what we do see is a fragmentation in the far right. And I don't know where this is going, but some political leaders aren't talking about bipartisan legislation. We're talking about nonpartisan legislation to get around the fact that bipartisan is considered a political statement disowned by both ends of the political spectrum. So, but the polls do suggest a strengthening of US support for Ukraine. And most certainly conversations are occurring to release some of the restrictions placed on America largesse provided to the Ukrainian armed forces. This is a good thing. And there's open conversations about, if we provided 4th generation fighters and training to those pilots now, they could be available for that spring or for that first frosting. This could be something that would end this war perhaps quickly. But we're also walking away from the circular argument that you hear in America that we can't let Putin justify the use of a low-yield nuclear weapon. Hence, we can't give Ukraine the tools they need to win. And since they don't have the weaponry to win, they can't win. If they can't win, why are we providing them anything at all? And if we're not going to win, and if we're not providing them anything, why don't they sue for peace now? That discussion, which at one time I think gripped 40% of America, is starting to lose wind. Fortunately, it's diluting. So I think from here going forward, and supercharged by the dissension that we saw on the highway to Moscow, you will see the Biden administration leading as best they can a more energetic engagement in Ukraine. But here, speaking a little bit about warfare, don't expect anything revolutionary to occur here in Ukraine. Combat is as it was always. Submarines didn't make navies obsolete. Nuclear weapons didn't make war obsolete. The machine gun didn't stop offensive operations. All of it generally remains the same. What does stop future conflict is a better understanding of democracy, strength, transparency, economic solidarity, and investing in places like Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we count on the United States, notwithstanding that we have to do as Europeans our homework. Well, we have almost 20 minutes. Questions from the floor, because I have many. Yeah. Please, brief questions. Yeah. Oh, what is the... Oh, you have the mic. In the meantime, may I ask you, what do you make about freedom today? How can we make freedom in the 21st century survive? Because this is one of the issues that are in the backdrop, as a backdrop of our conversation. So,
I think the answer is very clear. Freedom is the ability for people and for nations to decide of what they want, and it's the other very interesting point in this terrible year 2022 that if we look, for example, at Iran, we see the Iranian women mobilizing themselves for freedom, and in fact, throughout the world, it's true that during these terrible decades, as it was said, democracy clearly was declining, but we have always people able to risk their lives to get freedom and to defend freedom. We have this in Ukraine, we have this in Iran, we have this in Turkey, in China, in Russia with Navalny. And so that's a real matter of hope. And as it was said before by the Nobel Prize, the key for freedom is education. Freedom as democracy is not natural. It's you don't. We are not born as a citizen of a democracy. Freedom, it's education and responsibility, and so that's why education is key. And it's, of course, one of the most worrying points in the Western nations to see how, in most of our countries, education is in a very bad situation.
Which I think, as our Nobel Peace Prize said, I mean, education is not just information, it's backboning the citizen. Your question, please.
My question reflects to what Mr. Debski was saying and Mr. Bütikofer. So first, you were referring to this language barrier between Russians and Europeans, in that Russian establishment didn't use the war and instead military operation, and that that's because they understand the language which is used here of the rule of law. And that's one side, and the other one is how well we in Europe understand the language which is used there. And it seems that until at least recently it was not really the case to understand well for example, while sending a message of being ready for a compromise, at the other side it was rather taken as a message of weakness. And there the question is, how much do you think we progress in understanding the language which is used by Russian establishment nowadays? And in this case, can we talk about this revolution in Denk art as maybe a notion of this change compared to previous Ostpolitik and Wandel durch Handel?
Thank you. May I add a footnote to this question to you? Honestly, it's about language, but it's about substance, and I think that the two questions are complementary in the sense, honestly, my question, what I ask myself is how you make the difference between collapse and decay in a regime that has the nuclear button in a shaky place.
Well, that's it's the very important questions introducing us to 1 hour discussion at least. But I try to be brief. Churchill said in 1939 in October that Russia is a riddle wrapped in the mystery inside of enigma. It happened that Polish code breakers broke the enigma code, so maybe I will try to explain how it was. For Russia, it is not a war about territorial conquest. It is a war which was defined as existential for Russian identity. Putin and collective Kremlin believes that there is no Russia without Ukraine. So Ukraine has to be destroyed. Ukrainian nations has to be annihilated, because if Ukraine does exist, it means that the whole country, the whole nations would become antithesis of Russia. So that's an approach they have. Can we compromise with this kind of approach? No, because it would mean that we have to surrender Ukrainians' freedom. Ukrainians, as every other nations under the sun, have a right of a very basic right to freedom, have full right to live in a sovereign nation, a sovereign state, and have full right to choose to what institution they would like to belong in. So there is no way how we can force Ukrainians to compromise, because it's not only about territory, it's also about the freedom of their people. If we agree that part of Ukraine is to is to remain under Russian occupation, it would mean that some Ukrainians, millions of them, would stay under Russian rule, and they would be nationalized, they would be Russified, they would be purged, and it's not a theory. We see it in practice. So that's why there is no other way to solve the problem but to defeat Russia. And this defeat of Russia would also contribute to our long pursued policy of delegitimizing war, because we need to create an example to all others that there is no benefit in restoring to force. It is not benefit for anybody to restore to a war of aggression. We have to prove it, not only to ourselves, but also to the Russians.
Well, thank you. You still have to respond to this idea of difference. How do we make the difference between decay and collapse? But I'm going to take a question. No, go ahead, because the mic has to travel. This lady over there in black. So the mic has to travel. Maybe in the meantime, we make good use of the microphone over there. Okay, go ahead.
Well, very briefly, I think that's the first concept to believe that a nuclear nation cannot lose war. Americans lose numbers of wars, starting from Vietnam, and ending on Afghanistan. Not all wars in which nuclear power is engaged has to automatically lead to use of nuclear weapons. That's the first point. It's a much more complicated issue, but just to say one sentence on the question, it would be like that.
Okay, well, go on.
Hi, thank you. So for Admiral Franken, I was wondering, throughout the conversation, it's come up that inconsistencies in the way that democracies like the US support that democracy and that freedom have emboldened authoritarians like Putin. So I'm wondering, you've mentioned that the Biden administration has stepped up to support Ukraine, which is certainly true. But there have been criticisms with regards to US policy towards Venezuela, Iran, China, and questions about how strong we are in standing up to those regimes. I'm wondering to what extent that purported inconsistency in foreign policy impacts our support of Ukraine.
That's a good one.
Well, I don't think we're wholly inconsistent. I would like to see us perhaps develop a little more benevolent perspective to show those nations that there is a way to squirm out from their dictator and autocrats. And I'd like to see more of that, because sometimes I believe keeping the thumb down has a tendency to keep them down. And I hearken back to 1995 when we opened the door to Vietnam. Suddenly Vietnam became self-sustaining, an economic powerhouse. And although they've stayed under this umbrella from Hanoi, but it's not really that nation as you head south. And matter of fact, having spent time in Hanoi, it's really not the case there either. So I think places like Venezuela, and I would have liked to have seen us having a rapprochement with Iran at the turn of the century. I think we had an opportunity, and we missed it. Regarding being more strict, I think you have to watch that. And through a settled process, which is our legislature and our international policy arena, we've held the line, but we've allowed a little bit of migration in our relationship to see, depending on who comes into a leadership position in those countries, perhaps they'll see some kind of flourishing. So it's complicated.
Well, we have two more questions, one Laure and then Andrew Mythe. But before, Reinhard, one for you. The European Parliament has been extremely vocal in backing the US, the Ukraine pathway to NATO membership. Do you think that the last events have changed or could change this approach of the European Parliament, where you have been, one of the major cooks?
The fortunate thing about the European Parliament is that with regard to supporting Ukraine, all the 5 major democratic groups, starting from the Conservatives, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Liberals and Greens, are kind of similarly hawkish. And that has given the Parliament more of a say than we would otherwise have. And I don't think the Parliament is about to change that. We will keep pushing.
Okay, well, no.
Merci, thank you. I think that, at the approach of Vilnius, the Western leaders give the impression that they are they have a dilemma. They're hesitating, weighing two different things. The one, that they have this urge to support Ukraine. They would like to give these famous, guarantees of securities to Ukraine at Vilnius and open some kind of path to NATO, clearly. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have this fear of the nuclear threat that Putin keeps throwing at us nearly every day. And I'm wondering how each of you would respond to this dilemma. We've heard today Alexandra Matvichuk very clearly stating that if we allow ourselves to be taken hostages by the threat of the nuclear weapons, we will become, kidnapped, actually, in our securities by any dictator with a nuclear weapon that would like to take some territory and move forward. So what would you do, and what do you think will be done in this regard, in this context, at Vilnius?
Well, while you think about your response, Andrew, just take this one.
Okay, thank you very much. Fascinating panel. Just a general question to all the panelists, because I keep hearing we were naive, we didn't appreciate what was happening, Wandel-Durchhandel, export-driven modernization, we're waking up from strategic slumber. Are we not being too easy on ourselves? How much corruption has seeped into our systems? For 30 years, we've allowed unrestricted access to 2 dictatorial regimes to every level of our society. I'd like for us to put a mirror in front of ourselves and just say, where were we when corrupt politicians were lobbying for business deals? And that's true about Europe and the US, corporate leaders. Every single time we saw violence in the system, and yet we pretended that we believed what we preached. Are we not being too easy on ourselves? I'd love the panel to comment. Thank you.
So food for thought and few minutes to respond. Who wants to go first?
Well, I will be happy to. I mentioned capitalism a couple of times. And the reason I did is because in the pursuit of that dollar and the evacuation of industry, et cetera, we have done that and we've set aside good sense. I'm surprised the question from the young lady wasn't regarding Saudi Arabia. We have set aside sensibilities and been exceedingly easy on some nations, blind to their ambitions because of the almighty dollar. And government needs to be the referee. And sometimes we are not. And when we're not in the end game, we make a mistake. And it costs lives, and it causes disruption globally in this case.
Well, but you are not off the hook. You have the other question. Law's question. Oh, you are not going, there is no free lunch? There is no free lunch? I'm sorry. No lunch at all. No, we're going to have lunch at Spanish time.
I take your lunch if I...
So, what do you think? But Reinhard, your...
as regards to the last question, I'm sure there's been corruption, and there's been corruption in so many countries. Raffarin, Schröder, many other names. But I don't think it's the main issue. I think more important was a certain cultural and political arrogance where we wanted to fool ourselves in the belief that we were superior and everybody else had no option but becoming like us. And because of that, we didn't realize that there were different futures developing around the globe. I think that is even more detrimental. And as regards your question, ma'am, I would say Putin's nuclear threat is a paper tiger. I don't believe that it is excluded that he might use it, but I am quite convinced that we cannot let ourselves be under the spell of that threat. And when you listen carefully to what leaders from elsewhere, outside of Europe, say, then I think we can understand that he would be running quite some risk, because neither the Indians nor the Chinese that have refused to denounce his war of aggression would countenance such a step, nor would countries in the global south. He would make Russia the perennial enemy of everybody, of humankind. And even though we can't exclude that he's crazy enough to do it, I think that would be a very high risk that he takes, and it would certainly defeat his core goal of reviving the Russian Empire. After that, Russia would never again even be a middle power.
Well, amen.
So real quick, to that point, in 2016, military officers such as myself huddled to redefine what a valid order was. I would expect in Russia today, their senior officers are having this same discussion. What is a valid order? And I believe that that is an impediment to the worst tendencies of Vladimir Putin.
Well, thank you. I mean, you have a rain check for the other question. Thanks to this response. Now, I mean, you and then we switch mic on the two questions.
Yes.
so-
Very, very briefly, I think we should not underestimate Putin's nuclear threat. However, we need to be very credible in deterring Putin in that. And I think that the West was quite credible and quite clear what would happen if Vladimir Putin restores to this kind of tool. And the message was that Russia will lose this war more if they use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So we will be engaged simply, and we will help Ukraine much more to win this war. That's one. That's on the deterrent side. And one comment on corruption. Well, there is a lot of talk about Ukraine as a corrupt country, and we cannot do this and we cannot do that because they are corrupt. Well, we would be much more credible, and I agree with Andrew Mythe fully, we would be much credible in sending this message and preaching the others about the corruption. Had we followed all politicians and punished them and investigate the issue of the corruption on our side. And Nord Stream 2 is a very clear case because in German courts blocked investigations actually on Nord Stream 2. So if we are talking about rule of law and corruption and all these things, we have to be credible on our side in this effort.
Yes, very, very briefly. First, on your question, if you look the history of Europe, for centuries you had two big empires corrupting European elites, Russia and Turkey. And this is always the situation today. Second, debt capitalism, bubble capitalism is a crook capitalism. And third, for Europe to be dependent on Russia for energy, for China on essential goods, and for the US on energy, weapons, agriculture, technology, security, this is clearly a terrible asymmetry, and of course this is not reasonable and sustainable, and you have risk of corruption. When it comes to Law's question, very briefly too, I believe that you have to take different different horizons and time scale. Today, as it was said, the priority is to give to Ukraine the weapons that it needs to win. And so you don't need to be integrated into NATO today to do this. You have to, the second point is rebuilding, reconstruction, and we have clearly to plan this from now. And third, at the end, and this signal can be given today, Kissinger pointed out I think he was very right, saying that the middle choice for Ukraine that was chosen by NATO, not in and not really out, this was a big mistake. So we have to be very clear that when the peace will come, Ukraine will be a member of NATO.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you to the panel. To the panelists, thank you all. We are 6 minutes behind the schedule, and ça c'est les 5 minutes de la cuisinière. So on time. Thank you all. I think that we went to la substantifique moelle.
But with Anna, it's a Spanish hour for the lunch.
But no. We in Spain, we will go to aperitivo now. Lunch at 2:30. So anyway, thank you, and we reconvene just after lunch